Well, folks, in today's video, we're going to be working on this 462 Tyco mantua Baltimore and Ohio steam locomotive. This was sent in a few days ago from a gentleman by the name of Adam. This belonged to his grandfather, and it apparently has not run in 50 years, which means this thing has probably not been run since around the late 1960s, which is pretty incredible. It seems like a long time, but honestly, looking at the contacts and stuff, it's very possible that it has not been run for a very, very long amount of time. When locomotives sit for a while, a lot can change. Contacts and things like that, like any metal, can oxidize over time. The other thing is lubricants and things like that can dry and seize. So we tested this thing. It didn't start. But Tyco mantua engines are really, really tough, and honestly, a lot of these things, you just open them up, clean them, get the dried lubricants and stuff out, clean all the contacts. Well, they'll usually just fire right back up again. So I'm pretty confident we'll be able to get this thing working again. I mean, there's no guarantee with anything, but yeah, we'll give it a shot, and maybe we'll get this thing riding the rails once again for the first time in 50 years. Wouldn't that be awesome? Anyway, I'm going to take this thing over to the track so I can show you exactly what the condition of this thing is, and then we'll get working on it, because I want to show you all the places to work. Maybe because maybe you have a steam locomotive or any HO scale locomotive that hasn't run in a long time, and you can actually apply a lot of the same rules to getting it running as I'm going to try to apply to this one today. So let's get started. Now I'm going to be very surprised if this thing does anything different from the last time, but I just want to set it up to show all of you exactly what's going on with this thing, just so we can get an idea of what we need to work on. So we'll get all the wheels on just as is, and we'll give it some power and see if it responds at all. Last time we didn't get any current draw, which means the motor and light and everything isn't picking up any power. And as we wiggle it on the track, we're still not seeing any current draw over on that meter right there. Well, actually there's a tiny bit, but that might just be the needle shaking from me trying to wiggle this thing around. So I think this thing is just not picking up its power. These wheels are super oxidized. I don't entirely trust that electrical system there. Kind of looks not so great. And same goes for the front wheels. So we're going to check all those places, but there are a whole bunch of other spots which could be troubled points. So we're going to also investigate those. And hopefully we'll get this thing running once again. That would be pretty awesome, I think. So let's bring this thing back over to the workbench and get working on it. So the very first thing we're going to do with this locomotive is we're going to strip it down to the motor and see if we can make the motor turn by just manually turning it with our hands. And if that works, we'll go from there, because that will tell us a lot about the condition of this locomotive. So we're going to remove the screw which is located in the smokestack. This is very common on tons of steam locomotives, especially older, models that are mostly die-cast and stuff. You can find this quite often. And on this particular model, we got a screw here and a screw here. So we're going to undo both of those, and then the rest of the chassis should just drop out. And we'll be able to have a look at that motor, and we'll learn a lot. I'd suspect that the commutator, which is the thing which gives power to each of the coils, it's likely oxidized, which is probably why this thing is mostly not starting. But we'll be able to test the motor, and we'll also find out if the gearbox and everything like that is seized. I don't think it is going to be on this model, but you never know. So anyway, let's flip this up here, and there's our motor. And well, as I suspected, it's definitely not seized. But we are going to have a look at this piece right here, which is the commutator. It's located behind this brush. And on a lot of these older locomotives, you get these motors. I believe they're called Pitman motors. And these are actually usually not that difficult to work on. And what I always do when I encounter one of these, you remove that spring. And sometimes you have to wiggle these out. In this case, this one just fell out. And we can have a look at that. And this doesn't look too bad, but that very well could be oxidation on the motor. So we're going to take this tool right here. This is a fiberglass pencil. And we're just going to polish up the metal, and it will scrape off any oxidization, dirt, debris. This one seems to be really clean, actually, but sometimes you open these things up and they can be kind of nasty, so we're going to do this. Sometimes with these older motors, if they've been sitting for a while and you start them back up, sometimes they'll actually remove the oxidation themselves, because if you can get them spinning with power, the friction of the brushes will scrape off the oxidation, so they almost auto clean in a sense. The only thing you really have to watch for on older models, especially ones that have a lot of miles on them, are the little spaces in between the metal plates on the commutator, because these can fill up with carbon from the brushes and all sorts of other little bits of stuff. And if these get dirty, these can prevent your motor from turning over, and they can even burn it out because they'll cause shorts. So always check these, because I've seen it almost every old model I've worked on has this problem. Some of them it's not that bad, some of them it doesn't really prevent them from running, but others it does. And I've actually found that kind of ozone smell that a lot of older models have. It seems to come from here, I've noticed. After I clean this, I don't find there's as much of a smell, so that's another thing to note. So yeah, with that all cleaned out, we will now connect some leads to this motor, and we'll see if it springs to life, and then if it does, we'll go from there. We might have some electrical problems, but for the most part, things are not looking too bad for this model. I've seen much worse in the past. If you want, you can also clean the brushes. It's not a bad thing to do, but these don't look oily or anything like that, so I don't think it's going to be a problem if we just put them back in. So we're going to put this one back in here, and we'll pull that spring back around it and just get it positioned all nicely. And you want to make sure the other one, the spring, is pushing it in properly, because that can be a big problem. You need decent pressure on the brushes for it to work properly. And then I've got some leads from a controller here. And something that I always do before I test something is I do a little spark test. And if you see spark, you know that there's power in each of these leads, because you know, I sometimes forget to like plug in my controller or turn the power on or something, and you know, you can think whatever you're working on isn't working because of that. But if you do this, at least you know that what you're giving power is actually getting power, because I can't tell you how many times I made that mistake. So it's just a little something I do, because even these wires can sometimes become disconnected from the controller if you're moving it around a lot. So it's just a good thing to do. Now, if we give this thing some power, we'll put one wire directly on there. And it doesn't seem to want to start, but it could just be, yeah, just a little oxidized, and just let it turn over. And well, it's running, so that's a good start. We're going to stop it there though, because you can hear some kind of funny noises. None of this is really lubricated at this point, so we're going to lubricate all that, and then we'll let it run a little more. And then we're going to go looking for electrical problems, potentially with the wiring, and we'll clean up the wheels and everything like that. And yeah, then hopefully this thing will work nicely. So we're going to lubricate all the bearings in this thing. We're going to put a little bit on this back one here. You don't need a crazy amount for bearings. We're going to put a bit on this front one. I usually get it from the outside, just because you don't want to put any close to the commutator, because if it gets on there, it will burn, which is really something you want to avoid. It's really bad for the commutator. And as for the motor, that's pretty much all you need to do. We use really light oil. I usually use something like Labelle 102 or something like that. It's not necessarily the best oil out there. I haven't played around with a crazy amount of them, so there may be a better one, but just use kind of like a light oil, and you should be in business. And we're going to lubricate this, but we're going to use some grease and oil. It's just better because there's a lot more friction here than there is with the other parts. And then on a steam locomotive, you want to just put a tiny bit of oil. I put a little too much on that one, but just little drops on each of the screws. And this is where steam locomotives are a bit more particular than diesels. You just need to put a little bit on each of these points right here. Little pieces that go actually inside the model. Anything that moves, really, you want to have some oil on there, because oil breaks friction up. And it just helps things last longer and operate smoother. So you want to make sure everything is lubricated. So as for the outside of the model, that's pretty much good. As we come down here, there are a lot more spots which you can lubricate. You can put a bit of oil here, here. You can put some right here. You don't need a crazy amount. Just a little bit will do, because it will spread around evenly, and you don't want these things to be swimming in oil. So first of all, not great for them, but also if you put too much oil, it's going to end up on your track. It's not something you want. Now on these tyco mantua models, the steamers, most of them have a few screws on the bottom. You can find this on other models as well, actually. They'll just have like a little plate, and this actually holds all the wheel bearings for everything in. And you always want to check these because they can get dirty, and also they need to be lubricated. So just take off the plate and have a quick peek. It's not something that takes a crazy amount of time, but it's a really important part to these models. And like I said, it's not even just Tyco Mantua that uses these. I can't think of another manufacturer off the top of my head that goes about it this way, but this is pretty common on older models from the 50s and 60s. And yeah, we should be able just to now lift that plate off. Try to keep the wheels in place, because if they pop out, you don't want to lose any of the bits for the valve gear. These bearings are really clean. Sometimes these are really old and greasy, in which case you want to lift these out one at a time and just kind of clean them out. But you can see these are all pretty shiny. So all we're going to do is lubricate them. You can buy lubricants, oils. What I would highly recommend is whatever you do buy, make sure that it is conductive lubricant. So like there's a brand I use called Conductilube or something like that. And not only will it lubricate, but it will actually improve how well each bearing picks up power. So you'll improve the performance of your steam engine, which is just terrific. So yeah, now we can put this all back together. I don't know if this is the case for all Tyco Mantua models. It would appear that this one actually uses one of the screws for the plate to hold in the motor. So I've accidentally disconnected the motor doing that. But if we line it up right and just screw it down, we should be okay. I don't know if I've ever opened up this specific type of steam locomotive before. I have one really similar to it, but yeah, I wasn't aware that it did that. Learn something new every time I open up one of these things. But in any case, we'll put the rest of the screws back in, and we should be in business. So I've now got some Labelle 106 and Labelle 102 mixed up. It's a ratio of, I think, like 1 to 4. So there's 1 part grease, 4 parts oil. You want to change those ratios up depending on the age of the locomotive, like the condition of the parts, but also the type of parts, because if you're working with parts like these, I believe these are made out of nylon, there's not a whole lot of friction in these parts. You know, plastic parts and things like that, there's just not as much as there is with metal parts. So when there is more friction on older parts, especially older metal parts, you want to use more grease, because the thicker the viscosity, the better protection it's going to make between the parts, because essentially the lubricant gets in between these two parts. It's allowing them to barely touch each other, and it gets between them and lubricates them, which is why it turns better, also why the parts last a lot longer. So the thicker the lubricant, the less friction there is. But the thicker the lubricant, it's harder to move around. So for parts that don't need thicker lubricant, use a lower or higher viscosity. Always mix them up. But in either case, it should be more liquid if you're using parts that don't have a lot of friction, less liquid if you're using parts that do have a lot of friction. So I hope that's easy to follow. Didn't do a great job at explaining it, but something along those lines. Yeah, anyway, we're just going to put the rest of this grease on there, and we should be good from that standpoint. And then all we need to do is maybe let this thing run a little bit with some leads connected to the motor, and yeah, then we'll clean a whole bunch of contacts off and put this whole thing back together. So at this point, I think we can put the model together. I've pretty much got the whole thing turning over really nicely, so that's good. So we're going to put it all back together, and then we're going to clean up all the contacts and what have you on the inside, just because they're definitely quite oxidized. So we're going to work on all of that. We're also just going to check all of our electrical connections to make sure that everything is functioning as it should be, because you know, if it's not going to perform properly. So anyway, we're just going to make sure this all goes back together as it should. And I've got this off just by a little bit, so we're just going to slide the whole thing forward, and then it should all be seated correctly. I think the first screw I'll put in, yeah, I'll put the two back ones in, because I think I dropped the one that goes in the smokestack somewhere on the floor. Actually, no, it's right here. Never mind. We'll put these ones in first, though. It doesn't make a huge difference. So yeah, we'll tighten this one down. I'll put the other one in. If ever you're putting screws in, by the way, and one goes right in, but the other is off by a little bit, like you're trying to screw two things together, just leave one screw kind of loose, and then put the other one in, and then tighten them both down, because that will ensure that they're even. Because that's another problem. I don't think it's a issue with this particular model, but I have seen that happen with some stuff where it's just off by a little bit. But if you loosen the screws, it leaves you enough room to adjust, and then you can put the screws in right. So you can put them in like that. And then once you have them in, you can torque them down a little bit more. I mean, obviously you don't want to strip them or anything, but you want them to be, tight enough they're not going to find their way out of there. There we go. So those are decently torqued down. And we're just going to pop that back in there. We do have a front piece to this cab. This looks kind of broken. Might have been meant to go somewhere out here. I don't know. Optimally, you would put this piece in before you reassembled that. In fact, you might have to with this model. I can't really tell though. Yeah, I need to loosen this up to get that part in, because that's supposed to be behind those two pieces of metal. My bad. So we've now got the whole model back together, and we're going to test the electrical connections, because frankly I don't entirely trust them. So we're going to put the locomotive in this foam cradle here, put it upside down, and we're going to put some test leads in certain spots and see if the engine will run. And like I did before, a little spark test. Now on these tyco mantuas, you've got two grounds. You've got one on the locomotive, one on the tender. They're wired together correctly. It should fire up if you put one right here on like a screw. You want to pick something kind of exposed, because other things may have like paints and stuff which will prevent the power flowing through them. Yeah, they're right on the chassis of the tender. And what we're seeing is nothing's springing to life. If we tap around there, it seems like we might be getting a bit of something there. But if we put it directly on this piece of metal here, which is the wire, you can see it's springing to life. So it seems like the tender is not doing a perfect job at picking up power. But these wheels are super oxidized, so we're going to clean them off, see if that makes a difference. I also want to tighten up this screw. In fact, I want to take this off and clean it, because that looks not so great. So I've got those wheels looking pretty shiny. I got the back ones all cleaned up too, and I got them all oiled, so that should be good. Got that all cleaned up, so there's only one thing left to do, which is to take this thing over to the track and test it. I'm going to be honest with all of you, most of the time when I fix these things, I'm really not so sure if they're going to start, but I feel a lot more confident about this one than a lot of previous ones, just because for the most part, all the parts seem to be in pretty good condition, so provided I've done everything right, this thing should start up, and hopefully it will run okay. But in any case, let's give it some power and see what she does. Yeah, all right, we've got a runner. Very nice. Okay. Well, that's pretty good. It's a very fast model. Look at how fast it's going. That's at about 65% roughly, and it's booking it. Yeah, let's see. How fast can this thing go? Wow. Yeah, for an engine of its age with a 5-pole, that's pretty fast. I'm going to slow it down because that's kind of risky, but yeah, that's not too bad. And does it reverse okay? Yeah, reverse seems fine, no problems there. Let's try the low speed. Seized out a little there. Let's see on a straight if we can get it doing a low speed. And hear the motor revving. Yeah, it's struggling with the low speed a little. Yeah, it's like it's trying. I don't know, some of these electrical connections might still not be perfect. Well, it's not bad, but definitely could use some improvement. But heck, overall, we turned an engine which apparently hasn't run for 50 years into a runner once again. So I guess that's something to be happy about. And overall, I think it's running pretty good. It's not too loud, and it's pretty darn fast. Probably the fastest tyco mantua steam engine I've ever seen, so that's pretty nice. But anyways, before I finish off the video, I'd just like to thank Adam for sending this locomotive once again. It's very generous, and I'm glad we could get it working again. And with that, I'd like to thank you all so much for watching.